Today we're diving into the serial killer Iceberg. What starts with names almost everyone knows quickly, descends into some of the most obscure and unsettling cases in criminal history. This iceberg is divided into multiple tiers. The higher levels contain the cases that are widely known, while the deeper we go, the more unknown and disturbing the stories become. Some of these cases changed history. Others have almost disappeared from public memory. Let's begin with Tier 1. Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. During the 1970s, Bundy murdered numerous young women across several states in the United States. He was known for manipulating his victims and escaping from police custody more than once before finally being captured. His case gained worldwide attention because of his appearance, his courtroom appearances, and the large amount of media coverage surrounding his crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, is one of the most well-known serial killers of modern times. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys in Wisconsin and Ohio. His crimes shocked the world when investigators discovered the scale, of what had happened inside his apartment. The case became one of the most discussed criminal cases in history and remains widely studied today. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer known as the Killer Clown. During the 1970s, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Illinois. He was called the Killer Clown because he performed at events dressed as a clown while hiding his crimes from the people around him. His case became one of the most infamous examples of a murderer living a seemingly normal public life. Jack the Ripper is one of the most mysterious names in criminal history. In 1888, a series of murders took place in London's Whitechapel district. The killer targeted women in the area, and despite a massive investigation, his identity was never confirmed. More than a century later, Jack the Ripper remains one of the most famous unsolved cases in the world. These are the names that almost everyone has heard of. But as we go deeper into the iceberg, we leave behind the most famous cases and enter stories that are far less known. Richard Ramirez, better known as the Night Stalker, terrorized California during the mid-1980s South. Unlike many serial killers, Ramirez had no consistent victim profile. He attacked people of different ages and backgrounds, often entering homes at night. His unpredictable methods and the fear he created made him one of the most notorious criminals of his time. He was eventually identified and arrested after a large public manhunt. David Berkowitz became known as the Son of Sam after a series of shootings in New York City during the 1970s. His attacks created widespread panic, with many people afraid to go out at night. Berkowitz claimed that supernatural influences had driven him to commit the crimes. Although investigators later questioned those claims, the case became one of the most heavily covered criminal investigations in New York's history. Andrei Chikatilo was a Soviet serial killer whose crimes remained unsolved for years, operating between the late 1970s and early 1990s. He targeted victims across parts of the Soviet Union. Investigators struggled to identify the killer because of investigative mistakes and limitations within the system at the time. His eventual arrest brought one of the largest serial murder investigations in Soviet history to an end. By this point, we've moved beyond the names that almost everyone recognizes. From here on, the iceberg begins to focus on cases that are increasingly obscure and less familiar to the general public. Pedro Lopez, often referred to as the Monster of the Andes, was responsible for a series of murders across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru during the 1970s. His crimes crossed multiple national borders, making the investigation especially difficult. Although he is considered one of the most prolific serial killers in history, his case is far less well known outside of South America. Dennis Rader became known as the BTK Killer, a nickname that stood for bind, torture, kill. He committed murders over several decades while maintaining what appeared to be an ordinary life. For years, investigators were unable to identify him, until he resumed communication with the media, ultimately leading to his arrest. His ability to avoid detection for so long made the case particularly notable. Robert Hansen operated in Alaska during the 1970s and early 1980s. He lived an outwardly ordinary life, but investigators eventually uncovered a series of murders connected to him. His case remained hidden for years before a survivor helped authorities identify him. Because of where his crimes occurred and the limited media attention at the time, his case is less widely known than many other major serial killer investigations. We've now reached a point where many viewers may not recognize the names anymore. From here on, the cases become increasingly obscure, often remembered only by dedicated true crime researchers and historians. Anatoly Onoprienko was a Ukrainian serial killer who carried out a series of murders during the 1990 South. His crimes spread fear across several communities, and investigators spent months trying to identify the person responsible. Although his case received major attention in Eastern Europe, it remains relatively unknown in many other parts of the world. Yang Xinhai was a Chinese serial killer whose crimes took place over several years. His case is considered one of the most significant serial murder investigations in modern Chinese history. Despite its scale, it received comparatively little international media coverage, making it unfamiliar to many people outside China. Tsutomu Miyazaki was a Japanese serial killer whose crimes shocked the country during the late 1980 South. The investigation attracted enormous attention in Japan and led to widespread public discussion about crime and media coverage. Outside Japan, however, the case is much less widely recognized. We're now entering the deepest parts of the iceberg. At this stage, the cases become increasingly obscure, often remembered only in regional history or by dedicated true crime researchers. At the very bottom of this iceberg is Alexander Spasivasov, a Russian serial killer whose case remains largely unknown outside Eastern Europe, despite the scale of the investigation. For years, he managed to avoid drawing significant attention while carrying out a series of crimes from his apartment. Neighbors occasionally reported unusual behavior, but nothing initially led investigators to uncover what was happening. It wasn't until authorities entered the apartment that the full extent of the case began to emerge. Investigators described what they found as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. The case shocked both law enforcement and the public. Although it received major attention in Russia, it never became as internationally known as cases like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. The combination of its severity and lack of global recognition is why Alexander Spasivasov belongs at the deepest level of this serial killer iceberg. That concludes the serial killer iceberg. While some of these names became known around the world, many others have faded from public memory, despite the impact their cases had. The deeper we went, the more obscure these stories became, showing just how much criminal history remains unfamiliar to most people. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see another iceberg covering a different true crime topic, let me know in the comments.